In this video, we're going to talk about some of the controversies in English as a lingua franca research. Now, ELF research has been quite controversial since the beginning, and anyone who does research into it very quickly gets used to the controversies surrounding the subject. Now, quite a number of these controversies are actually based around misunderstandings and misconceptions of what ELF is. And probably the biggest misconception is that ELF is a variety of English. Now, ELF is not a variety of English. Some of the early research began looking at ELF as if it was a variety of English, but it quickly established that there was too much variation and too much adaptability for it to be a variety. So ELF research looks at uses of English, not at descriptions of English as a variety. So connected to the misconception or misunderstanding that ELF is a variety of English has been the idea that the features and characteristics of ELF described so far, so the grammatical features, the phonological features, the aspects of communication strategies, the idea has been that these are simply descriptions, but they have often been misrepresented as prescriptive rules that should be applied to language teaching or language policy. Now, this is not what ELF researchers have argued. They have said that they're simply conducting empirical research describing how English is used and the variety of uses it's put to. So some of the other controversies have involved attitudes and ideology towards English. Now, by ideology I mean the sets of beliefs and ideas people have about language. Now, some people have objected to ELF as legitimising incorrect English or poor uses of English. But I think this is a misunderstanding. What people here are confusing is standard English as it's described in textbooks or as it's described in teaching materials, and English as it's actually used. And of course ELF research is about describing English as it's actually used. But of course there are going to be disagreements and controversies around what is acceptable English and what is not. And linked to this subject is also the idea of native and non-native speakers of English. Now, in some senses there are no native speakers of English as a lingua franca. English as a lingua franca, as the definitions of it show, is a contact language or a language of intercultural communication. So hence there are no native speakers of ELF. All people are communicating in what is a second language or a second variety or dialect of English. Other controversies have linked to the idea of linguistic imperialism. Now, this is the idea that as English spreads around the world, it also spreads with it English values. By that they mean British or American power and values, whether it's economic power or political power or the power of their ideas. But I think this is a very one-sided view of the spread of English. English has also been spread by people who are non-native speakers or English as a lingua franca users of the language. And English is adapted quite considerably to that. And lastly, I think some of the controversies in ELF research and the approaches ELF takes to language bring us to the heart of some of the current controversies in applied linguistics. They really bring up questions about what is language. If we're describing all this variation in English and all this adaptability and change in English, then how do we decide where English finishes and another language starts? How do we decide what is English and what isn't English? Now, I don't have any neat answers to this, but I think ELF really brings us to the heart of this question of what is language. It also brings up questions of how language relates to communication, because in ELF research it's been shown that it's not just about the linguistic forms and the structural features of language. Communication strategies, intercultural awareness, linguistic awareness are as important as a knowledge of or a competence in features of the language. So again, the relationship between language and communication is brought to the fore by ELF research and other kinds of intercultural communication research.